to call her a friend. She is a mother, a businesswoman, and the first Black woman to become a city council member in Lancaster, California. Angela is here to testify because her brother, Dave Patrick Underwood, he was tragically and senselessly murdered in the line of duty 2 weeks ago in Oakland. We mourn and pray for Angela and the entire Underwood and Floyd family. As a member of the Federal Protective Service, Pat was guarding a federal courthouse, a symbol of equal justice and the rule of law, during the riots in Oakland on the night of his death. It appears his death was part of a targeted attack on federal law enforcement. We pray that justice comes swiftly and completely for Pat, for George Floyd, and all victims of violence. Pat Underwood should be alive today. George Floyd should be alive today. David Dern should be alive today. And so should countless others. And though we cannot bring them back, we can learn from their lives and deliver the justice and change they deserve. I hope that every member of this committee will listen closely and carefully to what Angela has to say. Our nation must listen and it must heal. Like Dr. King, we must reconcile our differences with a renewed sense of love and compassion. Like President Lincoln, we must remember that we are not enemies, but we are friends. Friends that have a responsibility to rise above, to make sure we become the more perfect union we strive to be. And I hope at this moment in time, we rise to the occasion. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. Ms. Underwood-Jacobs, you may begin.
Thank you very much, and I truly appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As a nation, as a people, we must come together to defeat fear, hate, prejudice, and violence. I want to ensure the memory of my brother, Patrick, is as a catalyst against injustice, intolerance, and violence of any kind. I want to honor my brother, Dave Patrick Underwood, and our family, and help our nation think about how to navigate the righteous path to equality, freedom, and nonviolent systemic change. I want to extend my sympathies and condolences to George Floyd's family. Mr. Floyd's murder was just not cruel and reprehensible, but criminal. The officers involved should be brought to justice and held accountable for their actions or as well as their inaction. I wish that same justice for my brother Patrick, who served with distinction and honor as a federal officer for the Department of Homeland Security, until he was murdered anonymously by blind violence on the steps of the federal courthouse in Oakland, California. As he took his last breath on the cold, hard cement after being shot multiple times, he died. Fear, hatred, ignorance, and blind violence snatched the life of my brother Patrick from all of us. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached, "Always avoid violence. If you succumb to the temptation of using violence in your struggle, unborn generations will be recipients of a long and desolate night of bitterness. And your chief legacy to the future will be an endless reign of meaningless chaos." I have spoken to many people across this country, in fact, across the world, regarding what is going on in America. America is in pain and she is crying. Can you hear her? I am here to seek justice through the chaos for my brother Patrick, for George Floyd, for citizens of all colors, for communities across America, and for the police officers that protect those communities and their citizens every day. The actions of a few are dividing us as a nation, at a time when we should be coming together and uniting for the well-being of all people. We will never solve generational systemic injustice with looting, burning, destruction of property, and killing in the name of justice. We must find lawful, peaceful solutions that uplift and benefit everyone. And this is greater than a black, white, or blue issue. It is a humanity issue. When those in a position of authority choose to abuse their power, that is the very definition of oppression. And when innocent people are harmed in the name of justice, no one prevails, we all lose. Everyone deserves the opportunity to feel heard, be seen, and feel safe. Police brutality of any kind must not be condoned. However, it is blatantly wrong to create an excuse out of discrimination and disparity to loot and burn our communities, to kill our officers of the law. It is a ridiculous solution to proclaim that defunding police departments is a solution to police brutality and discrimination, because it's not a solution. It gets us nowhere as a nation and removes the safety net of protection that every citizen deserves from their community's elected officials. There is a path to achieving what we desire and deserve as a nation and as a people: equality, fairness, justice, peace, and freedom from oppression. It is the same path we started on during the Civil Rights Movement. The solution to our nation's ills are straightforward. Education. We need to actually invest in education again and make it our nation's top priority. Through education comes knowledge, through knowledge comes understanding, and through understanding comes opportunity and freedom. Jobs. If there isn't any chance of making a decent living, there isn't any chance of having a decent, just society. We need to create more jobs that in turn will create more economic justice for all Americans. Housing. There is no way to live a decent life if you can't find, or in America's case, afford shelter. We need to listen and learn from each other. It's time for everyone to open their ears and listen to what each other has to say. America is the world's melting pot because we have so many people, cultures, beliefs, and points of view. And somehow we've become siloed. As a single voice in this chambers, attempting to honor my brother and family, I hope I can make a difference today. I want America to make a change. I want you as our representatives in Congress to make a change so that no one ever has to wake up to the phone call that I received telling me that my brother was shot dead and murdered. How my brother died was wrong, and I'm praying that we learn something about how he lived. Patrick was the type of man that when our mother fell to the ground as she was dying, he picked her lifeless body up as her spirit was leaving to place her upon her bed because that's where she wanted to die. My question is, who will pick up Patrick and carry his legacy? I believe this is a responsibility for all of us. Please do not let my brother Patrick's name go in vain. Patrick was a good man who only wanted to help others and keep his community safe. He had an infectious laugh and a corny sense of humor. He would go out of his way to help family, friends, and strangers. He did not deserve to die in such a horrendously inhumane way. No one does. Now, my family is in a state of hollow disarray. We all feel the anxiety of wondering what tomorrow may bring or may not bring, which has struck fear in our hearts. Nevertheless, I wholeheartedly urge us all Americans, not to give in to hate and anger, but to resolve conflict with kindness and love, to lead with a sense of purpose and renewed energy to create positive change, as I have outlined here through education, jobs, housing, and listening. Pat didn't tell anyone how to live, but he lived. And what an amazing life it was. I will never forget the way my brother smiled and the way that he loved his family with every piece of his heart. My wish is for us to live and live without fear and discrimination. Do not simply tolerate your neighbor, but strive to understand one another. And we will be a better, more just society for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next witness is Art Acevedo, who serves as the Chief of the Houston Police Department and also serves as President of the Major Cities Chiefs Association. Chief Acevedo received his BS in Public Administration from the University of Laverne. Chief Acevedo, you may begin.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Underwood, Mr. Floyd, all of us at our condolences know that we're lifting you in our prayers. Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to participate virtually in today's hearing. It's good to be with all of you, and especially my Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee and Congresswoman Garcia. I want to thank Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee and Congresswoman Bass for their leadership. As the Major City Chiefs Association reviews the Justice and Policing Act, please know that we support the intent and look forward to working with the committee. I appear before you today as the Chief of Police in Houston, Texas, and it is also my privilege to testify on behalf of the Major City Chiefs Association as their president. No matter the circumstance, every time a life is taken, a loved one is taken. George Floyd was a child of God and raised in Houston. His death was deeply disturbing and a shock to the conscience. Over the past few days, I've had the opportunity to meet with the Floyd family, and I will continue to lift them in prayer. Mr. Floyd, thank you to you and your family for allowing us to join you on your brother's journey home. There is no denying that changes in policing must be made. Out of crisis comes opportunity, and this is an opportunity for all of us to have some tough conversations, to listen, to learn, and to enact meaningful reform that is long overdue. As a profession, we must learn what is being shared with us. That includes being honest about our history. We must acknowledge that law enforcement's past contains institutional racism, injustices, and brutality. We must acknowledge that policing has had a disparate treatment and impact on disenfranchised communities, especially communities of color and poor communities. Several topics have risen to the forefront, and all reforms must be vetted and ensure that they are sustainable, effective, and have no unintended consequences. Several topics have, law enforcement plays an important role. No two calls for service are the same, and in Houston, we respond to an average of 1.2 million calls for service annually. Those calls disproportionately originate from communities of color. If we are going to talk about better policing, we also need to talk about the root causes behind the need for those calls for service. Some think defunding the police is the answer. I'm here to tell you on behalf of our mayor and other mayors across the country and police chiefs across this country and the diverse communities that we serve, this is simply not the answer. Defunding the police without addressing the social economic reality faced by poor communities and the disenfranchised and how they are riddled with missteps, which would increase the need for police services. History has shown that underfunding the police can have disastrous consequences and hurt those most in need of our services. Appropriate police funding is critical to ensure agencies have resources to invest in technology like body-worn cameras, recruit qualified police officers who are service-minded, and train in implicit bias, train in cultural competency, train in de-escalation, and other critical training. The overwhelming majority of cops are good people. This cannot be lost. They are faithful public servants who put their uniform on every day, willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. We can't let, again, the actions of bad cops let us lose sight of the fact that most cops are good. We must all judge each other through the prism and content of our individual hearts and actions, and not through the prism of color and the uniform that we wear. While there is no national use of force standard and previous efforts at establishing one were met with disagreement, several components are ubiquitous throughout the U.S. Prioritization of the sanctity of life, duty to intervene, and the use of de-escalation tactics and techniques is a must. Let me be clear. The actions of the 4 officers involved in the death of Mr. Floyd are inconsistent, unjustified, and repulsive. They are contrary to the protocols of the policing profession, and they sabotage the law enforcement community's tireless efforts to build trust. Moving our profession forward begins with a sustained commitment to accountability. From the start of academy training, recruits must understand that they have an absolute duty to put public safety, service, and security first. In the Houston Police Department, we instill in our men and women the certainty that policy violations regarding truthfulness will lead to termination, or as we put it, if you lie, you die. It is important to note that every chief's administrative authorities are different across the nation, and that not everyone has the legal authority to take immediate action like Chief Arredondo did. I am encouraged what there have been eras in America's history when police have found it difficult to speak up. We are speaking up today. But let that be clear, for many years, officers have consistently been holding one another accountable, and complaints about police misconduct overwhelmingly originate from within agencies, not from members of the community. Communities have an absolute responsibility as well. We ask citizens to report police misconduct without fail. This will afford us the opportunity to investigate, track, and report those complaints. We must also address the issue of officers who have been terminated with cause only to get rehired by another department. Many of us refer to these individuals as gypsy cops. Many gypsy cops have exhibited troubling behavior, and that in turn undermines efforts to build trust with the public and efforts in terms of internal department accountability. Transparency breeds trust, and trust breeds respect. Mutual trust and respect between law enforcement and the public is crucial to good policing. The civil unrest occurring throughout our nation and throughout this entire country is a sobering reminder of how quickly we will lose public trust and the consequences of that fact. Ensuring the department looks more like the communities we serve helps build trust and confidence. Unique perspectives and insights help a department lead and serve the communities of color. I'm happy to report that the Major City Chiefs Association has several departments now that are minority majority, like the City of Houston and the Houston Police Department, and are reflective of the communities that we serve. On behalf of the Major City Chiefs, I want America to know that we hear you. We will continue to do everything in our power to facilitate your right to peacefully protest. The MCCA will not shy away from this challenge and will continue to be a leader and voice in the national discourse and race relations, policing, and reform. To the Floyd family and to the activists across the nation, our commitment is to be your voice, to join you, and to make sure that Mr. Floyd's death was not in vain. I yield the remainder of my time and look forward to any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Chief. Our next witness is Ms. Sherilyn Eiffel. Ms. Sherilyn Eiffel is the President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. She received her JD from New York University School of Law and her BA from Vassar College. Ms. Eiffel, you may begin.
Good morning. My name is Sherilyn Eiffel. I'm the President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the nation's oldest civil rights legal organization formed in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall. I want to thank Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan. I want to salute the leadership of Representative Bass and the Congressional Black Caucus on this issue. And I want to extend, on behalf of the Legal Defense Fund, my deepest condolences to the Floyd family and thank them for their courage and their voice at this important moment. We welcome the Justice in Policing Act as a first step in addressing the decades-long call and demand for policing reform. The legislation includes reforms that LDF's Policing Reform Campaign has advocated for years to ensure greater accountability for police officers who engage in misconduct and brutality. Members of Congress incorporated a number of our proposals in the act, which is a step in the right direction toward ensuring police accountability nationwide. I want to first focus this committee's attention on the significance of this moment and the importance of the federal government's role in addressing this crisis. You are in a civil rights moment. In 1964, 1965, 66, and 67, cities all over the North in this country were gripped by urban unrest. In Watts and Detroit, Harlem, Minneapolis, and scores of other cities, Black people took to the streets to protest police brutality. It was during that period of unrest that Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Riots are the language of the unheard." The 1968 Kerner Commission was created to study the source of that unrest. And much of the report's findings and recommendations focused on law enforcement presence and conduct in Black communities. This period overlapped with the years that most people think of as the core civil rights movement, when Black people in the South petitioned, protested, marched, and demanded federal legislation to address segregation, voter suppression, and economic injustice. The result were core civil rights statutes, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But despite the unrest in northern cities, in over 100 cities during that decade, there was no legislation to address the issue of police brutality in African-American communities. And as a result, very little has changed since that period as it relates to this issue. Therefore, too many officers know that they can commit the most heinous acts against African Americans without fear of accountability. Ranking Member Jordan said that the killers of George Floyd will face justice. But we also know that those who killed Philando Castile, Eric Garner, Terrence Crutcher, Eleanor Bumpers, Michael Stewart, Clifford Glover, Sean Bell, Amadou Diallo, and countless others never were held accountable for the crimes they committed. That snapshot of former Officer Derek Chauvin kneeling on the neck of George Floyd with his hands in his pockets, looking out with no fear of being videotaped, should shame every member of this body, every judge, every lawyer, everyone who has participated in the perpetuation of a system that calls itself a justice system, but routinely allows officers of the state to take innocent life with impunity. You have the chance now to change that. One of the key parts of the system of impunity has been qualified immunity, a defense that shields officials from the unforeseeable consequences of their act, but has been interpreted by courts so expansively that it now provides near immunity for police officers who engage in unconstitutional acts of violence. LDF has litigated a number of these cases. For example, in 2018, we filed a petition in the United States Supreme Court appealing a decision of the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit that affirmed summary judgment in favor of a law enforcement officer who tased our client, Carrie Illich, 19 times to death. The US Supreme Court denied the petition, and this case was not a one-off. Every year, cert petitions are filed in the court seeking review of cases in which law enforcement officers have successfully eluded accountability for the most violent forms of brutality by raising the qualified immunity defense. The Justice in Policing Act seeks to address qualified immunity by amending the civil rights statute used most in police excessive use of force cases, 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, and we welcome this amendment. We want it to apply to all civil suits that are pending or filed after enactment of the act, and we'll continue to work towards the elimination of qualified immunity. There's bipartisan support for ending qualified immunity, and so I'll close my remarks by quoting from a federal circuit court judge in a decision issued just this week in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. It was written by a judge appointed first to the bench by George W. Bush. And he said in Jones versus City of Martinsburg, Judge Henry Floyd said, Wayne Jones was killed just 1 year before the Ferguson, Missouri shooting of Michael Brown would once again draw national scrutiny to police shootings of Black people in the United States. 7 years later, we're asked to decide whether it was clearly established that 5 officers could not shoot a man 22 times as he lay motionless on the ground. Before the ink dried on this opinion, the FBI opened an investigation into the death of yet another Black man at the hands of police this time George Floyd in Minneapolis. This has to stop. To award qualified immunity at the summary judgment stage in this case would signal absolute immunity for fear-based use of force, which we cannot accept. This decision represents a minority of cases, and so we need Congress to act. You are required by history to meet this civil rights moment. It is a moment in which we have a chance to transform our approach to public safety, to recognize that most community conflicts do not require the intervention of an armed officer, and to speak our values through federal and state budgets that prioritize our commitment to anti-discrimination, to public health, and to true public safety for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next witness is Darrell Scott, who is the founder and senior pastor of the New Spirit Revival Center, a non-denominational church in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. Pastor Scott is also the author of the book, Nothing to Lose: Unlikely Allies in the Struggle for a Better Black America. Pastor Scott, you may begin.
Chairman Nadler, members of committee, Ranking Member Jordan, thank you for inviting me to participate in these very serious hearings today. I want to begin by stating that the prospect of defunding and or dismantling police forces across the country is one of the most unwise, irresponsible proposals by American politicians in our nation's history and makes absolutely no sense at all, at least to me. I believe it is nothing short of the politicizing of current social events in an effort to garner votes during this election season. I also believe that it's a reactionary measure that can and will result in short and long-term damage to American society, particularly in our inner city and urban communities. Now, I recognize the fact that the elimination of excessive force and physical retaliation by officers of the law against American citizens is paramount today. I recognize the fact that racial profiling and the harsh treatment of minorities is a very real reality that must be eliminated immediately. I myself can testify of times in my life when I felt racially profiled by police. I can testify of times in my life when I was pulled over for driving while black. I can testify of giving my grandson, who is now of driving age, the talk of how to properly behave if pulled over by police because he had the question of a very real fear of the possibility of death at the hands of police. In fact, my very first interaction with police when I was 13 years old resulted in me being roughed up. I could very easily have been George Floyd. George Floyd could have very easily been me, my brothers, my friends, or any number of any other black men in America. However, I do not recommend throwing the baby out with the bathwater by all police officers as bad cops simply because of the bad actions of a rogue segment of those whose job is supposed to be to protect and to serve American citizens. In fact, in certain inner city communities across America, increased funding for police and increased police presence is actually necessary in order to enforce the law and to guarantee the safety and the security of law-abiding members of those communities. As one years ago, I might be a pastor, but I didn't come down from heaven. I came up out of hell with the rest of everybody else. I was formerly in that street life. Than a reduction in police presence and police power. It would allow those with criminal intentions and criminal actions to flourish virtually unchallenged in the communities of America. The law-abiding members of society would be directly threatened by the absence of police or the inability of police to respond to criminal activities, and in many cases would endeavor to take the law into their own hands to ensure their safety and well-being, as evidenced by the response of some who decided to defend themselves and their property from vandalism. An absence of police presence could potentially give rise to acts of domestic terrorism, mob rule, gang rule, neighborhood intimidation, oppression, and vigilantism. Defunding of police departments has already happened in a number of American cities, and rather than remedying problems, has actually made conditions much worse. The city of Cleveland, my hometown, is a prime example of the results of police defunding. In 2004, the city of Cleveland laid off 285 officers. The entire police budget was slashed by 31%. To cover basic services, the following units were either disbanded or cut forever. The district strike force units, the narcotics unit was completely cut. SWAT was downsized. The fugitive unit was disbanded. The auto theft unit was disbanded. The intelligence unit was cut to bare bones. The mounted unit was cut 85%. The aviation unit was down completely for 3 years and is now only utilized during special events. The harbor unit was disabled. The boat sits rotting in a dry dock. The scientific investigation unit was cut 80%. All the lab techs were let go. All evidence collection is now done by priority. The DARE problem, the drug abuse resistance education program, was cut. Community policing was cut 45%. Cleveland went through a decade-long downsizing, which saw the department reduced from 1,900 officers to 1,500 officers on average. Zone car coverage, which directly affects citizens, has been cut. Police presence in any given district or in any given shift has been cut in half. 1- and 2-man units have been cut in half. Response time is dramatically longer if the police show up at all. The murder rates have climbed. The property crime is at record levels. Aggravated robbery statistics are higher. Drug sales, drug use, drug abuse is higher. Drug and alcohol-related motor vehicle accidents are the highest they've ever been. Cleveland has went from a relatively safe city per capita to an unbelievably unsafe city. Costs for service have increased even though the population has dropped significantly over the last 20 years. Once safe areas of the city are now unsafe. Once nice neighborhoods in the city are now not nice. Homicides are up 55% in Cleveland from this time last year, and Cleveland now has a higher murder rate per 100,000 residents than Chicago does. I believe that police departments are only as effective as politicians and their appointees allow them to be. Consequently, politicians and appointees are directly responsible for the state of their police departments. Law-abiding citizens, and I've spoken to a great deal of them, overwhelmingly think that defunding or disbanding police departments is a horrible idea. Community policing is a very viable option to address the needs of inner city communities. Having police in the communities to actually get to know the residents is the best way to obtain the results that we all want. When I was growing up, the residents and the business owners knew the police officers that were assigned to our neighborhoods, and their presence was a deterrent to criminal activity. So in short, defunding of police departments in America has already happened, and it is proven to be an epic fail. We cannot allow that paradigm to continue if we want the neighborhoods of America to be safe to live in, the streets of America to be safe for residents to walk on, and the communities of America conducive for businesses to thrive in. So I recommend and I agree with the fact that police reform, or better yet, police revision should be enacted. But it has to be one that is sensitive to the stress, tension, pressure, and paranoia that policing produces. The fact that on any given day, any given call, any given stop can result in an officer's death can be very challenging mentally, while also being sensitive to the citizens of America who are supposed to be protected by the police and not be enemies of the police, whether in the suburbs or in the inner cities, whether we're black, white, red, yellow, or brown. I really believe that most police officers, most cops began their careers, most bad cops began their careers as good cops, but they allowed the rigors of their job to affect their perspectives and their social interaction with those they are supposed to protect, and they began perceiving those that they are supposed to protect as those they themselves need to be protected from. I'm in agreement. I endorse police reform, but it has to be sensitive to both sides of that issue. Thank you for allowing me. God bless you.
Thank you. Before I call the next witness, I just remind witnesses to turn off their mics when you're not speaking. Turn them on when you're speaking, turn them off when you're not speaking, please. Our next witness is Mr. Paul Butler, is the Albert Brick Professor at Georgetown University Law Center, where he specializes in criminal law and race relations. Professor Butler is also the author of the book, Let's Get Free, A Hip-Hop Theory of Justice and Chokehold, Policing of Black Men. Mr. Butler received his JD from Harvard Law School and his BA from Yale University. Mr. Butler, you may begin.
Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan, honorable members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify. Mr. Floyd and Ms. Underwood Jacobs, I'm so sorry for your loss. May the memory of your brothers, the memory of the other martyrs be a blessing to the people all over the country, all over the world who are rising up in what Martin Luther King called the beautiful struggle for equal justice. There has never, not for 1 minute in American history, been peace between Black people and the police. And nothing since slavery has sparked the level of outrage among African Americans as when they feel under violent attack by the police. Black people have endured Jim Crow segregation, being shut out of Social Security and the GI Bill, massive resistance to school desegregation, nonstop efforts to prevent us from voting, and poison water. But the rare times Black people have set aside traditional civil rights strategies and instead have risen in the streets, destroyed property, and resisted symbols of the state has been because of something that the police have done. Watts in 65, Newark in 67, Miami 1980, LA 1992, Ferguson 2015, Baltimore 2016, Minneapolis in 2020. All of those cities went up in flames because the police killed another Black man. Unlawful violence is never acceptable, either as a misguided approach of a few or as an abuse of the power and trust we place in law enforcement officers. The main problem is not bad apple cops. Officers have difficult jobs and many serve with honor and valor. Still, almost every objective investigation of a police department finds that police as policy treat African Americans with contempt. The police kill, wound, pepper spray, beat up, detain, frisk, handcuffs, and use dogs against Black people in circumstances in which they do not do the same to white people. When armed agents of the state are harming American citizens in our name, we the people must ask why. In the past 2 weeks, we've seen acts of grace and bravery by police officers. Cops in New York took a knee. In Houston, Chief Acevedo arranged for an honor guard to accompany Mr. Floyd's body when he came home. Unfortunately, we have also witnessed these past 2 weeks, police officers commit deplorable acts of violence against the citizens they've sworn to serve and protect. In New York, officers drove 2 large police vehicles into a crowd of protesters. In Atlanta, officers broke the window of a car, dragged out 2 college students, and shot them with a stun gun. In Buffalo, a police officer knocked a 75-year-old man to the ground, but what happened next was just as bad. When 2 officers were disciplined for that criminal conduct, 57 other officers quit the squad in protest. President Obama's task force on policing decried the warrior mentality present among too many law enforcement officers. In Buffalo, the nation saw warriors on steroids. African American and Hispanic people disproportionately bear the cost. Blacks are about 20% of the population of Minneapolis, but 60% of the people who cops use violence against. The result is that there are more Black people in the criminal legal system today than there were slaves in 1850. When I mentioned to a young man I mentor that if he attended protests, he should wear a mask, he said he certainly would try. But he wanted me to know that as a young Black man, he has a greater risk of dying from police violence than from the coronavirus. According to the National Academy of Science, 1 in 1,000 African-American men and boys will be killed by the police. What African Americans need to realize equal justice under the law is for selective enforcement and police brutality to end. We need the police to stop killing us, to stop beating us up, to stop arresting us in situations in which they would not do those things to white people. The Justice in Policing Act is a common sense reform. Among other things, it requires cops to be trained on understanding racial bias. In Minneapolis, as 3 officers crushed the life out of Mr. Floyd, and another served as a lookout, somebody in the crowd said to the cops, "He's human, bro." But these 4 officers did not treat Mr. Floyd like a human being. Too often, police work seems to enforce the dehumanization